To the auctioneer, Mason was just a homeless man living in a rusted van. To the bidders, Barron was just a tired old dog. They were all wrong. They did not realize they were looking at a master combat engineer and a legendary K9 tracker. When Barron sensed movement inside a dusty architectural model, he did not just find a rat. He clawed open a conspiracy hidden under layers of plastic. A bag of uncut diamonds, a dead man's confession, and a brand new skyscraper set to collapse on 2,000 people tomorrow morning. Now a ruthless cleanup crew is closing in, but they are about to learn one painful lesson. Never corner a soldier and his dog. The rain in Seattle did not just fall. It hammered against the earth with a rhythmic persistence that reminded Mason Ford of things he wanted to forget. Sitting in the driver's seat of his rusted Ford Econoline van, Mason watched the water streak down the cracked windshield. He was 38 years old, though the deep lines etched around his eyes and the gray streaking his temples suggested a man who had lived through several lifetimes. As a former combat engineer, he had spent years dismantling explosives and building bridges in hostile territories, but now his biggest battle was simply finding a dry place to sleep without being told to move along. Beside him sat Barron, a 7-year-old German shepherd with a coat of distinctive gray and white fur. Barron was a retired military working dog, discharged alongside Mason. The dog sat with a quiet, stoic dignity, his brown eyes scanning the parking lot with an intelligence that went far beyond simple obedience. His muzzle was frosting with white, and his hips were stiff on damp mornings like this, but his spirit remained unbroken. He was the only family Mason had left. Mason checked his wallet. $412. That was it. Every cent he had to his name. The auctioneer, a large man with a voice like gravel in a blender, shouted for the sparse crowd to gather around Unit 402. The metal roll-up door clattered open, revealing a dusty tomb of forgotten possessions. The smell of mildew and old paper wafted out into the wet air. Most of the bidders groaned, seeing only stacks of cardboard boxes and yellowing plastic sheets covered in decades of dust. Mason stepped closer, his boots squelching in the mud. His trained eyes scanned the clutter. He spotted a black case near the back, barely visible under a pile of rolled-up blueprints. It was a set of Rotring technical drawing pens. Mason knew tools. He knew those pens were expensive, precision instruments. If he could clean them up, they might sell for enough to buy food and gas for another month. Suddenly, Barron stiffened. The dog let out a low, urgent sound from his throat. Not quite a growl, but a specific signal Mason knew well from their days on patrol. Barron stepped forward, the leash pulling taut, and sat resolutely directly in front of the open unit. He stared into the darkness of the locker, his ears pricked forward, ignoring the rain soaking his fur. Trust the dog. That had been the golden rule in the sandbox. It had saved Mason life more than once. "I will open the bidding at $50, the auctioneer yelled over the sound of the storm. Mason swallowed hard. $400, he said, his voice raspy but firm. The crowd fell silent. People turned to look at the homeless man, bidding a fortune on a pile of apparent garbage. Going once, going twice, sold to the man with the dog. Mason let out a breath he did not know he was holding. He had just gambled everything on a hunch and a set of pens. Before the auctioneer could hand over the paperwork, the distinct hum of a high-performance engine cut through the sound of the rain. A sleek, black luxury sedan tore into the muddy lot, splashing dirty water onto the bystanders. The driver door opened and a man stepped out. This was Vargas. He looked to be in his 40s, dressed in an immaculate charcoal suit that cost more than Mason van. He wore dark sunglasses despite the gloom, and his polished leather shoes looked ridiculous in the mud. He was the head of risk management for a massive corporation, though he moved with the predatory grace of a man who buried problems rather than solved them. Vargas scanned the crowd and locked eyes on the auctioneer. "Is Unit 402 sold?" he demanded, his voice tight with restrained panic. "Just closed," the auctioneer said, pointing a thumb at Mason. Vargas turned to Mason, his lip curling slightly in disgust at Mason-worn field jacket. Listen, friend, I will give you $5,000 cash for the contents of that unit. Right now. No questions asked. Mason looked at the wad of crisp bills Vargas pulled from his jacket. It was a life-changing amount. It was enough to fix the van, buy warm clothes, and eat well for months. But Mason saw the sheen of sweat on Vargas' forehead and the way his hands shook ever so slightly. This was not generosity, it was desperation. And in Mason's experience, desperation usually hid something dangerous. "No deal," Mason said quietly. Vargas froze. The polite mask slipped for a second, revealing a flash of cold menace. "You are making a mistake," he warned. Mason ignored him and signaled Barron to heel. As they walked toward the unit to claim their prize, Vargas pulled out his phone, snapping a picture of Mason's license plate as the rain continued to pour. Mason steered the rattling van under the concrete shelter of an old viaduct on the outskirts of the city. The rain was still falling in sheets, creating a curtain of gray water that separated them from the rest of the world. Here, amidst the shadows and the damp smell of wet concrete, Mason felt safe enough to inspect what he had just bought with his last dollars. He cleared a space in the back of the van, pushing aside a stack of woolen blankets, and hauled the largest item from Unit 402 inside. It was a massive architectural model standing nearly 4 feet tall. Even under the dim dome light of the van, the structure was impressive. It was a replica of the Skyline Tower, the gleaming new skyscraper that dominated the city center, set to open the following week. The model was incredibly detailed, with miniature trees, tiny cars, and a sophisticated LED lighting system built into the base. Mason reached for a rag to wipe away the layers of dust coating the plastic facade. He was looking for the case of Rotring pens he had spotted earlier, hoping they were tucked somewhere inside the large box the model came in. Suddenly, Barron let out a sharp, agitated whine. The large German shepherd was pacing in the cramped space, his nose pressed frantically against the base of the tower model. His tail was stiff, and a low, rumbling growl vibrated in his chest. Mason paused. "Easy, Barron, it is just plastic." But Barron ignored him. The dog began to scratch at the plinth of the model, his claws making a harsh scraping sound against the painted wood. Mason leaned closer, annoyed that the dog might damage the only thing of potential resale value. That was when he saw it. Small, dark pellets scattered near a ventilation grate at the bottom of the structure. Rat droppings. A rodent had made a nest inside the hollow base of the luxury tower. Before Mason could pull him back, Barron lunged. The dog barked once, a deep booming sound in the enclosed van, and struck the model with his front paws in an attempt to flush out the prey. The tall, top-heavy structure wobbled violently and then tipped over. It hit the metal floor of the van with the sickening sound of cracking plastic and splintering wood. Barron immediately shoved his snout into the wreckage, sniffing frantically, but the rat had likely fled long before they parked. Mason sighed, looking at the shattered remains of his investment. The base of the model had split open like a cracked eggshell. Mason reached down to pick up the pieces, and his hand brushed against something soft. It was not a rat. Tucked inside the hollow space where the electrical wiring was housed lay 3 small bags made of black velvet. They had fallen out when the rats had chewed through the internal mounting brackets. Mason picked one up. It was heavy. He loosened the drawstring and poured the contents into his calloused palm. Even in the poor light, the dull, glassy stones were unmistakable to a man who had served in conflict zones rich in minerals. Uncut diamonds. They were rough, unpolished, and worth more than Mason could earn in 10 lifetimes. His heart began to hammer against his ribs. Why would an architect hide a fortune in diamonds inside a model? He looked back at the broken base. Taped securely to the underside of the plastic foundation, hidden from view unless the model was destroyed, was a black SD memory card. Mason felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. He retrieved his battered military surplus laptop from under the passenger seat and booted it up. He inserted the card, his fingers trembling slightly. There was a single video file. He clicked play. The face of a man filled the screen. It was Arthur Vance, the famous architect who had been declared dead from a stroke the previous year. But in this video, Vance looked terrified. His face was gaunt, his eyes sunken and darting nervously off camera. "Sarah, my darling, if you are seeing this, I am so sorry," Vance whispered, his voice trembling. "They made me do it. The Meridian Group? Vargas? They said they would hurt you." Vance held up a set of blueprints to the camera. His finger traced the foundation line. "They forced me to sign off on the changes. We reduced the steel reinforcement in the support pilings by 30% to save costs." 30%, Sarah. The soil analysis was faked. If there is even a light earthquake or high winds, the Skyline Tower will not just crack, it will fall like a sandcastle. The video cut to black. The sound of the rain drumming on the roof seemed to fade away, replaced by a high-pitched ringing in Mason ears. He closed his eyes and saw it again. The flash of light, the roar of collapsing earth, the screams of his squadmates buried under tons of unstable rubble in a tunnel halfway across the world. He remembered the weight of the stone, the darkness, and the silence that followed. 2,000 people were scheduled to move into that tower next week. Mason looked at Baron. The dog had settled down and was resting his head on Mason's knee, sensing the sudden shift in his master mood. "We cannot let this happen again, buddy," Mason whispered, his voice thick with a resolve he had not felt in years. "We have to stop them." The Seattle Public Library was a sanctuary of silence, a sharp contrast to the chaotic noise inside Mason Ford Head. He had left Baron guarding the van in the underground parking structure, cracking the window just enough for air, but not enough for intrusion. Mason sat at a public terminal, the hood of his damp jacket pulled up to obscure his face. He had inserted the SD card into a reader he carried in his pocket, his fingers moving across the keyboard with the practiced efficiency of a man used to handling sensitive intelligence. He copied the video file to 3 different encrypted cloud servers. Redundancy was a lesson learned in blood. Data that existed in only one place did not exist at all. Once the upload bars turned green, Mason opened a browser and typed in a name: Arthur Vance. The search results were immediate and disheartening. Dozens of articles appeared, all dated from the previous year. The headlines were uniform. Renowned architect Arthur Vance dead at 58. Mason clicked on the first link. The official report stated that Vance had suffered a massive stroke in his home on the evening of October 14th, 2024. Mason froze. He checked the timestamp on the video file he had just watched. It was recorded on the morning of October 14th. Vance had recorded his confession, hidden the evidence, and was dead less than 12 hours later. This was not a stroke. This was a cleanup operation. Mason felt a cold fury rising in his chest, a familiar heat that tightened his jaw. Vance had tried to do the right thing, however late, and he had been silenced for it. Now, 2,000 people were about to move into a tomb disguised as a luxury tower. Mason ejected the card and pocketed it. He needed to move. As he walked back toward the parking garage, the hair on the back of his neck stood up. It was that old sensation, the prickly awareness of being watched, that had saved him from snipers in the desert. He slowed his pace, blending into a group of teenagers leaving the elevator. When he reached the level where he had parked, he did not walk directly to his van. Instead, he stopped behind a concrete pillar and scanned the area. His rusty Ford Econoline sat in the shadows, looking like a bruise among the newer cars. But it was not alone. Parked 2 rows over, positioned with a perfect line of sight to his van, was a nondescript gray sedan. The windows were heavily tinted, and the engine was off, but Mason noticed the faint heat shimmering from the hood. Someone had arrived recently and was waiting. Vargas. The corporate fixer was thorough. He must have used the license plate photo to access traffic camera feeds or a private database. Mason realized he had underestimated the reach of the Meridian Group. Mason approached his van from the blind side, crouching low. He did not get in. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small telescopic inspection mirror, a tool he kept from his engineering days for checking under bridges and vehicle chassis. He extended the handle and slid the mirror under the rear bumper of his van. There it was, a small black box no larger than a deck of cards magnetically attached to the frame near the rear axle. A blinking red light confirmed it was active. A GPS tracker. Mason suppressed a curse. He had led them right to him. But then his eyes caught movement in the lane behind him. A large white delivery truck with a refrigeration unit humming loudly on its roof was idling, waiting for the exit gate to open. The side of the truck read, "Fresh Pacific Seafood." An idea formed instantly. Mason reached under his van, his hand steady despite the adrenaline. He gripped the tracker and pulled. It came free with a metallic clink. Staying low, he moved swiftly toward the idling truck. The driver was busy checking paperwork and did not notice the shadow slipping past his rear tire. With a firm thud, Mason slapped the magnetic tracker onto the metal bumper of the seafood truck. He waited until the truck rumbled forward and exited the garage before he unlocked his own van. Barron was waiting in the driver's seat, his ears perked. The dog let out a soft whine as Mason climbed in, sensing the tension radiating from his master. "We have to go, buddy," Mason said, starting the engine. He reached over and ruffled the thick fur on Barron's neck. As Mason steered the van toward the opposite exit, he watched the gray sedan in his rearview mirror. It remained stationary, its occupants likely watching a blip on a screen, moving north toward the fish markets, completely unaware that their target was slipping away into the city south. The fluorescent lights of the Megamart hummed with a low, headache-inducing buzz that grated against Mason's nerves. After the tension of the library and the parking garage, the mundane normality of a grocery store felt surreal. He pushed a cart down the pet food aisle, grabbing a large bag of premium kibble. Barron trotted silently beside him, his leash slack, but his ears were swiveling like radar dishes, picking up the squeak of cartwheels and the murmur of shoppers. Mason checked his watch. It had been 30 minutes since he swapped the GPS tracker. If Vargas was as good as Mason feared, he would have realized the deception the moment the seafood truck turned onto the highway headed north. As they turned the corner near the frozen food section, Mason saw them. Two men stood near the automatic entrance doors. They were not wearing uniforms, but they stood with the distinct feet-shoulder-width stance of private military contractors. They wore matching tactical windbreakers and earpieces coiled behind their ears. They were scanning the crowd with cold, methodical precision. Vargas had tracked the van license plate to the store security grid before Mason had ditched the signal. Mason's grip tightened on the cart handle until his knuckles turned white. He could not risk a confrontation here. There were civilians everywhere, families with children, elderly couples. He tapped his thigh twice, a silent signal. Barron immediately pressed his flank against Mason's leg, waiting for the command. "We are leaving, buddy," Mason whispered. He abandoned the cart and moved swiftly toward the rear of the store, aiming for the swinging double doors marked "Employees Only." The men spotted the movement. One of them tapped his earpiece and pointed. They began to move, cutting through the produce section with alarming speed. Mason burst through the double doors into the cavernous storage warehouse. The air here was cooler, smelling of cardboard and dust. He scanned the room. It was a dead end. The loading bay doors were rolled down and locked, and the only exit was the emergency fire door at the far end of the long concrete corridor. The footsteps of the pursuers echoed loudly against the linoleum floor behind him. They were closing the distance. Mason looked up. Above a pallet of paper towels, a red fire suppression sensor blinked lazily on the ceiling. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his Zippo lighter. He flipped the lid with a metallic clink and struck the flint. The flame flared to life. Mason grabbed a mop handle leaning against the wall, taped the lit lighter to the end with a strip of duct tape from a nearby shelf, and hoisted it up toward the sensor. 3 seconds later, the world dissolved into noise. A piercing alarm shrieked through the building, so loud it vibrated in Mason's chest. Then came the hiss of pressurized water as the sprinkler heads exploded open. A deluge of cold gray water rained down, instantly soaking everything. In the warehouse, the sudden downpour turned the polished concrete floor into a sheet of ice. Mason signaled Barron to run. "Go!" Barron launched himself forward, his powerful legs driving him toward the exit. But the floor was treacherous. As the large German shepherd tried to corner around a stack of crates, his paws lost traction. His claws scrambled uselessly against the wet concrete, and his legs splayed out. Barron slid violently sideways, crashing hard onto his hip. He let out a sharp yelp of pain and confusion, struggling to stand as his paws slipped again and again in the rapidly pooling water. The two security guards burst through the doors, slipping and cursing as the water hit them. They were 30 feet away. Mason did not hesitate. He did not run for the door. He turned back. Launching himself like a baseball player sliding into home base, Mason skid across the wet floor. He collided gently with Barron, wrapping his arms around the dog's massive chest to stabilize him. "I got you," Mason grunted, ignoring the cold water soaking him to the bone. "I have got you, boy." Barron looked at him, his brown eyes wide with fear, but seeing Mason's calm face, the dog stopped thrashing. Mason hauled Barron up, using his own body as a brace to keep the dog steady. With the guards struggling to wipe the water from their eyes and regain their balance on the slick floor, Mason guided Barron to the emergency exit. He slammed the push bar, and the heavy steel door swung open into the rainy alleyway. They tumbled out into the fresh air, leaving the chaos and the shrieking alarm behind them. Mason checked Barron's legs immediately. The dog shook himself vigorously, sending a spray of water everywhere, then nudged Mason's hand with a wet nose. He was shaken, but unhurt. "Good boy," Mason breathed, his heart pounding in his throat. "Let us get out of here." The abandoned automotive repair shop on the edge of the industrial district smelled of old grease, wet concrete, and rust. For Mason Ford, it smelled like an advantage. He knew every bolt, every beam, and every shadow in this building. He had worked here off the books for 3 months before the owner went bankrupt. Now it would serve as his fortress. Mason worked with the frantic precision of a man running out of time. He poured a heavy sack of fine graphite powder onto a metal tray positioned directly in front of a massive industrial exhaust fan. Above the main bay doors, he rigged a heavy canvas tarp to a rusted pulley system, securing the release rope to a workbench near the back of the room. Barron watched him from the darkness of a tool alcove. The German shepherd did not pace or whine. He lay still, his body coiled like a spring, his eyes fixed on the main entrance. He sensed the shift in Mason. The fear was gone, replaced by the cold, calculating focus of a combat engineer preparing a defensive perimeter. Outside, the crunch of tires on gravel announced their arrival. Car doors slammed. The heavy metal rolling door of the shop began to rattle as someone forced the lock. Mason stepped back into the shadows, his hand hovering over the electrical breaker panel. The door rolled up with a screech of protesting metal. 3 silhouettes stood framed against the rainy night. Vargas stood in the center, flanked by his 2 security contractors. They stepped inside, their flashlights cutting through the gloom. "Now," Mason whispered. He slammed the breaker switch. The industrial fan roared to life with a sound like a jet engine starting up. The sudden blast of air caught the pile of graphite powder, instantly blowing it into a thick, swirling black cloud that engulfed the entrance. The 2 guards coughed and staggered back, blinded by the fine dust coating their eyes and filling their lungs. In the confusion, Mason slashed the rope holding the pulley. The heavy canvas tarp dropped from the ceiling with a heavy thud, sealing the entrance and effectively separating Vargas, who had stepped further inside, from his backup. Mason stepped into the light, holding a heavy wrench. But Vargas did not cough. He did not panic. As the black dust settled, the corporate fixer stood calmly in the center of the garage. He reached up and adjusted a pair of sleek, tactical goggles he had put on before entering. He held a telescoping stun baton in his right hand, the tip crackling with a menacing blue arc of electricity. "Very clever, Mr. Ford," Vargas said, his voice amplified by the cavernous room. "But you are fighting a war with toys." He took a step forward, the electric baton humming aggressively. "You think you are saving people?" Vargas shouted, his composure cracking to reveal a fanatical intensity. "You are destroying them. The Meridian Group employs thousands of families in this city. We build the schools, the roads, the hospitals. This city runs on secrets, Mason. A few cracks in a foundation are the price we pay for progress. Mason tightened his grip on the wrench. You are talking about burying people alive. Vargas sneered and lunged, swinging the crackling baton toward Mason's head. Mason braced for the impact, but it never came. From the shadows of the tool alcove, a gray and white blur launched into the air. Barron did not bark. He moved with the silent, terrifying efficiency of a wolf. He did not aim for the throat or the face. He targeted the threat. Barron's jaws clamped down hard on Vargas's right wrist. Vargas screamed as the pressure of the bite crushed the nerves in his forearm. The stun baton clattered to the concrete floor, spinning away harmlessly. Barron used his momentum and body weight to drag the man down, twisting his body to pin Vargas's arm to the ground. The dog held him there, a low, rumbling growl vibrating through the man's bones, daring him to move. Mason kicked the stun baton away and knelt beside the fallen executive. He pulled a bundle of heavy-duty zip ties from his belt. Vargas, gasping for breath and clutching his throbbing arm, looked up at Mason. His expensive suit was ruined, covered in graphite and grease. Mason pulled the zip ties tight around Vargas's wrists. "Barron, release," Mason commanded softly. The dog immediately let go and stepped back, sitting at attention, his eyes never leaving the prisoner. The storm outside had intensified, turning the world into a chaotic wash of wind and water. Inside the garage, Mason stared at his phone screen in frustration. No signal. The thick metal walls of the old workshop, combined with the electrical interference from the storm, were blocking the connection. He had the truth in his hands, but he could not send it out. Vargas, zip-tied and sitting on the oily floor, let out a dry, humorless laugh. "You cannot stop it, Mason. The ceremony is tomorrow. By the time the police get through this weather, my lawyers will have me out, and this building will be a parking lot." Mason ignored him. He looked up at the skylight on the roof, where rain was hammering against the glass. "Watch him," Mason commanded Barron. The German shepherd shifted his gaze from Mason to Vargas, a low rumble vibrating in his chest. Vargas shrank back against the tire rack. Mason grabbed the rusted iron ladder bolted to the wall and began to climb. He pushed open the roof hatch and pulled himself up into the teeth of the gale. The wind hit him with the force of a physical blow, nearly knocking him off the slick, corrugated metal surface. Thunder rolled across the sky like the sound of a collapsing bridge, shaking the building beneath his boots. He crawled toward the peak of the roof, shielding his phone with his body. One bar of signal appeared, then two. Mason hit the Go Live button on the social media app. He did not point the camera at himself. He pointed it at the phone screen he was holding in his other hand, playing the video of Arthur Vance's tearful confession. Then he leaned over the open hatch, pointing the camera down into the garage where Vargas sat bound next to the pile of uncut diamonds. The view count started at 0, then 10, then hundreds. Within minutes, the comments began to scroll by so fast they were a blur. "My brother works concrete on that site," one user wrote. He said the mix was watery. "I live in the building next door," wrote another, sharing this everywhere. The truth was no longer a secret buried in a model. It was a wildfire spreading through the digital world. Then, through the howling wind, Mason heard it. The wail of sirens. Not just one, but a chorus of them, cutting through the storm. Blue and red lights began to flash against the wet pavement of the industrial park below. Mason slumped against the ventilation pipe, the adrenaline leaving his body in a rush. He looked down through the hatch. Barron looked up, his tail wagging slowly. It was over. 1 year later, the sun shone brightly over the lush green grass of the Second Chance K-9 Center. The air smelled of pine and fresh earth, a stark contrast to the grease and rain of Seattle. Mason Ford stood in the center of the field, wearing a clean polo shirt with the center logo embroidered on the chest. He looked younger, the deep lines of stress around his eyes softened by months of peace and purpose. He was instructing a young veteran who was learning to walk with a prosthetic leg, guided by a golden retriever. "Trust the dog," Mason called out gently. "He knows the way." Sitting in the shade of a large oak tree nearby was Barron. The German shepherd was 8 years old now. His muzzle was grayer, and he moved a little slower in the mornings, but his eyes were as sharp as ever. Around his neck, gleaming in the sunlight, hung a new collar tag. It was not a military dog tag, but a custom-engraved medal presented by the city council. It read, K9 Honor, Civilian Hero. Mason walked over and sat down in the grass beside his old friend. He picked up a tennis ball and tossed it gently a few feet away. Barron snatched it up and nudged Mason's hand, asking for another throw. "You did good, partner," Mason whispered, scratching the dog behind the ears. They had found more than just justice in that storage unit. They had found a way home. The bond between a soldier and his dog is forged in fire and sealed with unwavering trust. Mason and Barron taught us that even when the world turns its back, a loyal heart will always guide us home. If this story resonated with you, please help us share this message of hope by liking the video and subscribing to our community. Your support allows us to honor more unsung heroes like Barron. Another incredible journey of courage and friendship is waiting for you on the screen right now. So click there to keep the spirit alive.